Hey there, my name's Mark McCartney and welcome to the What is a Good Life podcast. Over the last 3 years, I've interviewed over 200 people around this question, not to prescribe you with the universal answer, but to help you to find and define your own answer to this question. I'm hoping the guest lines of inquiries, curiosities, and experiences prompt your own inquiry into what this question means to you. While I'm also trying to share with you what I believe to be more genuine expressions of the human experience and indeed meaningful conversations. Which brings us to this week and the 76th episode of the What is a Good Life podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Parker J. Palmer. Parker is a writer, speaker, and activist who focuses on issues in education, leadership, spirituality, community, and social change. He is the founder and Senior Partner Emeritus of the Center for Courage Renewal. He holds a PhD in sociology from the University of California at Berkeley, 14 honorary doctorates, 2 Distinguished Achievement Awards from the National Educational Press Association, and an Award of Excellence from the Associated Church Press. He is the author of 10 books, including several award-winning titles that have sold over 2 million copies and been translated into 12 different languages. Among them is Let Your Life Speak, which we touch on at times in this interview, and is comfortably the best book that I've ever read on themes of purpose or vocation. In this glorious conversation, Parker shares his journey of conversing with and listening to life, revealing more of his natural self in the process, his gifts and limitations, at times choosing the less conventional path, and ultimately guiding him to a life of vocation. He shares his experiences of depression, the significance of coming down to the ground, prioritizing being real over being noble, and the need for silence and settling our minds, for listening to life and for clarity. This episode offers so much wisdom to contemplate and is filled with various anecdotes, experiences, and realizations that will present you with many invitations to explore life a little differently. Parker really has a unique take on finding and exploring purpose and vocation in life, and also practical ways to track and follow life. Look, I enjoyed this conversation immensely. It was a huge thrill for me to interview Parker after reading this book, Let Your Life Speak. And as illuminating as I found the book, I found the conversation to be just the same. So I know you're going to take a lot from this episode. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you're on the podcasting platforms, please continue to leave your lovely reviews, as I greatly appreciate your support at this stage of my podcasting journey. Please check out the show notes below if you'd like to follow Parker's work or check out any of his books. And you can also find links for contacting me and indeed following the newsletter that accompanies this podcast, where I share my reflections on what the conversations you're listening to evoked in me. So look, that's all from me this week. I look forward to carrying on the conversation with you next week. So without further ado, the 76th episode of the What is a Good Life podcast. Parker, thank you so much for joining me here on the What is a Good Life podcast. As I've just mentioned to you in our little pre-chat there, your book Let Your Life Speak has had immense resonance with me. So I'm really, really grateful to have you here with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm pleased to meet you and have a chance to talk.
Wonderful. So as I tend to kick these things off, Parker, it is with the question of, is there a question you're trying to answer as you move through life?
Well, I think the question I'm holding at the moment is probably a version of the same one I've held for a long, long time. So I'm 85 years old, and that means that I'm shifting gears in a variety of ways. I no longer have the energy to do everything I was doing at 75 or 65 or 35. And I'm no longer very good at multitasking, which for me is a blessing. I've always thought multitasking was silly stuff, but when you can't do it anymore, you have a good excuse for not doing it. I think the question I'm still holding at age 85 is, what are my gifts that are still functional and deployable? And at what points do I most fruitfully intersect with the world in offering those gifts in the service of other people? That's a question I've held for a long, long time. It's, in some ways, as you know, Mark, it's the question at the heart of Let Your Life Speak, which is subtitled, it's a book about vocation and seeking our calling, listening for the voice of vocation. And so I'm still doing that listening, and the answers begin to take different forms at age 85.
Can you give me a sense, Parker, just how that's evolved for you, even if at whatever point in life, or even as you're alluding to more recently, paying attention to even how your gifts might be best deployed almost at different stages in life. Can you kind of give us a sense of what that almost relationship is and noticing for you?
Yeah, I think it's an evolving relationship that I think one never fully figures out, partly because it does take different forms at different stages, and partly because curious and interesting things happen as you come into conversation with your own life and with life in the world around you. A good conversation takes you in directions that you can't anticipate. It doesn't have foregone conclusions. And that's certainly been the case in my life. Let me give you a quick example from when I was 29 years old. So that's about 55 years ago. Um, so I was born in 1939, and um, I ended up doing a PhD in sociology at the University of California at Berkeley when I was in my mid 20s, fully expecting to go into academic life. I was the first person in my family to go to college. There were things that drew me to academic life, and I thought, okay, I'll get a PhD so that I'm qualified for a professorship. Well, as they say, an interesting thing happened on the way to the theater. Um, the 60s were, as you know, a time of great social upheaval. And a lot of that kind of came to roost in Berkeley in the 60s, as many people know who have historical curiosity. The cities were burning. The Black liberation movement was very much on the rise. The women's liberation movement. The war in Vietnam was raging, and there was a massive peace movement in this country and around the world um, to try to bring it to an end. And I found myself, once I got my PhD at age 29, I found myself more deeply called to use my knowledge and skills as a sociologist on the streets of the cities rather than in the halls of the academy. And so instead of taking one of the professorships that had been offered me, tenure track position at a major university, I moved to Washington, D.C., and with a couple of other people, uh, started up a community organizing institute in one of those areas that was subject to rapid social change and upheaval. We were focused on racial justice, which the great, unresolved American original sin that continues to do so much damage today because so many white Americans simply refuse to pay attention to it or to take it seriously or to own it, as they say, at any level. So we were focused on things like redlining and blockbusting and other underlying conditions that result in all of the social evils that flow from racism and from the doctrine of white supremacy, which always lurks just below the surface. And I spent 5 years doing that. Um, and I'll just pause to say it's a good example of a radical shift that happened because I listened to myself and I listened to life around me. Um, had you asked me when I was in my early 20s, do you see community organizing around racial justice as part of your future? I would have said, no way.
Yeah.
That isn't who I am. But it turned out to be who I was at that time. And after 5 years, I continued to track that thread in a variety of ways. We can get there later if you'd like. But at the moment, let me just use that as an example. And today, at age 85, just to fast forward, um, I continue to write. I've made my living largely as an independent writer and traveling teacher and workshop leader and the founder of a nonprofit organization called the Center for Courage and Renewal. Um, I've tried to continue to use my gifts that way. On the writing front, the result has been 10 books. And the last book was published in 2018. Writing has just been a refuge for me. It's been a source of growth for me. It's been a way to build community of a non-local sort around the country, indeed around the world. And so I've pondered, do I have another book in me? And I finally had to come to grips with the fact that the answer is no. I don't have a book. For me is a marathon, and I don't have the energy or the stamina for a marathon anymore. But I've discovered short form writing as a very satisfying way of exercising that gift. So, and of course, the internet serves me well in that regard. I can post a lot of short form writing in various settings where it actually gets read, rather than having to wait 5 years to finish a book and develop an audience around it. So that's been a big change for me, because for a number of years, book writing was one of the main things I did, and now I'm writing much shorter pieces, but with a sense of real satisfaction.
Could you give me a sense, Parker, just of you mentioned the word refuge there when writing. Can you kind of elaborate on that sense of refuge with regards to writing?
Well, I think it's a great question, Mark. I think for me, I'm sort of 50% extrovert and 50% introvert. And the extroverted side has been worked out through flying around the country, to some extent the rest of the world, but especially in the US, giving lectures and leading workshops and retreats that I was invited to do because of the books. So there's been this, in making my living independently, there's been this synergy between the writing and the speaking and workshop leading that has allowed me to just support myself and my family. But the extroverted side of all that, being in airport after airport, I spent half of my time on the road for probably 40 years. The extroverted side gets worked out in that way, gets satisfied in that way, but then I'm empty and depleted, and maybe even if that work gets too intense, maybe even a little depressed, kind of on the edge of feeling like this ain't me. This is. It felt that way yesterday, but it doesn't feel that way today. It's a good example, I think, of the running conversation one has with life, which keeps changing, keeps coming to slightly different conclusions. So the writing has always been for me a refuge, a way of coming home, settling into the silence and solitude that's necessary for me to write, and sorting out the experiences that I've had out in the larger world in dialogue with other people, where I continue to learn to this day a great deal, and what I learn informs my writing. So I'm testing my ideas, I'm generating new ideas, I'm seeing the world in new ways. Um, but if I didn't have the writing as a catch basin for all of that, as an opportunity to sort and sift it and reflect on it and hold it thoughtfully and think it through and feel it through, I imagine I'd be crazier than I actually am. And so in that sense, writing has been a refuge, a sanctuary of sorts, and I'm very grateful for it.
I think you can probably tell by my laughter to that crazier than I am comment that that writing probably serves me very well as well in other ways. Uh, but it's this. By the way, I love this sense of almost an equal part introvert and extrovert, and they both almost combine for the writing. It's almost the extrovert goes out and sees the world and provides like input or things to reflect on, and the introvert sifts through it and processes it in this kind of lovely sense.
Yeah, I think
And
it's a real it's a kind of economy in the
yeah,
generic sense of that term, right?
completely, and also this. I don't know, like a lovely sense as well. Then that it's they're both, it's each day that conversation goes on, because I think a lot of times people could be a little bit confused with their lives that, man, I'm doing everything I was last week and I was feeling pretty good.
Right, right, exactly. For me, one of the I learned at one point in my life, I learned a little bit about making pottery on a wheel. Took some courses and hung out with some potters. I was just interested in that craft. And one of the things I learned, which everybody learns eventually who stays with pottery for a while, is that a good potter does not look at his or her work as compelling this inert stuff called clay into the shape that the potter wants it to take. They they speak instead about a conversation with the clay. Yes, I have intentions when I approach that clay. When I get the wheel spinning, I put my hand on it. I have intentions, and a certain intentionality anyway for what I'd like it to do. But it has a mind of its own. It has a voice of its own, and so my hands are really in conversation with the clay. And good pottery, comes out of having a good conversation with the clay. It doesn't come out of forcing the clay to do what you want, which would often result in the clay just spinning apart and coming off the wheel, or taking an ungainly form. And that impressed me. When I heard that, I thought, yeah, life is a lot like that. Um, we're in conversation with a world that, and this is key, I think, and especially as a challenge to Western culture, we're in conversation with a world and with other beings who are not malleable, infinitely malleable, uh, and therefore cannot, and will not take any form we want to force them into. I mean, a lot of the Western mentality about approaching the external world, both the material world and the human world, is, by God, I have an aim for this, and I'm going to force it to come in, to assume the shape I want it to assume, whether that's another person or a river or a forest. And that's just not the way things work. We've done tremendous amounts of damage to the natural world and to each other, operating on that very arrogant assumption. But there's another way to be in the world and to approach the making of things and of cultures and societies, and that's to be in dialogue, to do the dance, to have that conversation, and to see, what serves the common good. I think what what serves what's most fitting for whatever it is we're working for.
just you mentioned earlier that it's in that life can't doesn't necessarily leave itself open to clear anticipation. You also mentioned silence there in part of your process for writing or coming back after periods away. And could you give me a sense, even just of the role that perhaps silence, and no, you didn't link these directly yourself, so just the role that your sense of silence has played in this, you know, conversation with life, or anticipate, like, acceptance almost of life, and maybe even not the forcing of a label or your will on top of life.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Let's just start with the fact that no good conversation is possible if the partners to that conversation aren't listening to one another.
Right.
Um, the most recent example for me is one of the most frustrating things about public political conversations is that good questions get asked of politicians, and then they answer any question they want to answer, especially if the question they were asked makes them uncomfortable or might expose a weakness. And that just doesn't work. It's one of the reasons our politics are always kind of falling apart. They're so sort of non-responsive. Uh, uh, a good conversation can't be non-responsive. You have to listen. You have to listen both for what's being said and for what's not being said. You have to listen, as they sometimes say about music, between the notes as well as to the notes, in order to have a full appreciation and to respond to who it is you're really dealing with. I think silence is also, and I'm thinking now of silence joined with solitude, which for me has been a very important practice. I think silence is also about um, giving the ego a chance to settle, giving the overactive mind a chance to settle, giving all of those inner dynamics in us, the neediness in us, the fear in us, the greed in us, giving all of these things that make the water more and more murky, right? They stir the water in a way that stirs up the mud and the gunk so that we become less and less able to see what's really there. But in silence, if we practice silence long enough, um, and join it with solitude, there's this great settling that can happen internally if you have the patience to wait it out, and if you understand what it is you're attempting to do. And as the mud settles, um, things start to become clearer. Oh, that's what's going on in this relationship. Or, oh, that's why I keep slamming into the wall on this job that I once liked, but I don't like anymore. Um, that's why I'm constantly thwarted in moving toward whatever it is I think I want to move toward. So I think silence, especially joined with solitude, it is, after all, a very ancient spiritual practice, um, and I think at the heart of all spiritual traditions, including I include secular humanism on my list of spiritualities, as well as the usual suspects, Buddhism and Hasidic Judaism and the mystical stream of Catholicism, etc., etc. All of these traditions, um, at their best, aim at helping human beings clarify um, their understanding of themselves and of the world, helping us get real, right? Helping us. Spirituality, I don't think, is so much about um, being noble as it is about being real, getting real. And that's why these practices from thousands and thousands of years ago seem worth engaging in to me.
This is a that's a I really like the idea of almost stilling the waters and the almost the clarity appearing as whatever we've stirred up with our daily busyness or whatever has a chance to settle, whether you're saying our neediness or fear or whatever it may be. I also love the sentiment of getting real. I think in solitude, and we can kind of examine or experience our reactions to things without the context or justification of a prevailing culture, or even just a peer group that may be suggesting that everything is as it should be, and if you feel a very different kind of way about that. This sentiment, though, of getting real and less about it being noble, could you? This resonates quite a bit. Could you elaborate on that sense of like reality, getting real, I guess, better than reality, that versus being noble?
Yeah, sure. I'd be glad to. And so let me, at this point, dip into another life story that um,
Please,
you know a bit about because you've read Let Your Life Speak, where I have a chapter on the several times in my life that I've gone into deep clinical depression for months at a time. I'm happy to say that none of those experiences has been permanent, um, and I've been free of that particular mental illness for some time now. I took that deep dive a couple times in my 40s and once in my 60s, and it's a horrific thing. I don't wish depression on anyone. I do feel called to talk about it though because it's endemic. It's especially as we are in what some people call the poly crisis with environmental degradation and political and economic collapse and the whole nine yards. The rise of the far right once again on our planet. Um, Lots of people are depressed for lots of obvious reasons. Um, in in my 40s, I worked with a therapist who listened to me for a long time, the way a good therapist does, in the same sense that we were talking about listening earlier. And when he finally thought he had at least part of the shape of who I was and what was happening to me, he made the following statement. He said, "Parker, you seem to image depression as the hand of an enemy trying to crush you, which is which was a very accurate, mirroring of what I was feeling at the time. It felt deadly, and it could have been deadly. It is for some people." He said, "Would it be possible for you instead to image depression as the hand of a friend trying to press you down to ground on which it's safe to stand?" Now that wasn't a magic bullet. That was not an immediate cure-all, but there was something about the that statement that that made sense to me and that I began trying to track as I continued on my own path of healing. And what I came to understand, Mark, has really been important to me, and it has to do with the question you just asked about nobility versus reality. I had been living at elevation. I was living at elevation in my ego. I was living at elevation in my ethics, trying to live up to somebody else's standards of nobility. I was living at elevation in my spirituality, which in those days was kind of an up and away thing for me. Um, and I could name some other ways in which I was living at elevation, but I think I've said enough for people to make sense of it. When you live at elevation and you trip and fall, which we do on a pretty regular basis, you have a long way to fall, and you might kill yourself, which for me is a pretty powerful image of why some people just can no longer stand the pain and the suffering that come with depression and decide it would be better to take their own lives. So you literally might kill yourself. But if you're living on the ground, if you understand, yes, I need an ego to function, but I don't need an ego that tells me I'm better than other people, right? Yes, I need an ethical guide to live my life, but I don't need one that comes from 2,000 years ago. I need the one that rises up in me as what it feels like to be a decent, kind, generous human being. Um, as for spirituality, I need the kind of spirituality that you find by going down into the ground of our being, rather than the one that takes you up, up and away into some heavenly place where the ego gets satisfied by thinking, I'm special and all those other people are going to hell. Well, you're not special and they aren't going to hell. But you don't know that if you're not taking that downward trip to the ground of being, which all human beings share. So, what I mean by getting real is getting down to the ground floor of life, whether it's in ego or ethics or spirituality or intellect. And I should mention that one as well, because I was living at elevation in my intellect, thinking that thinking would solve all the problems, right? And it doesn't. I mean, so the cool thing about living on the ground and getting real in that sense is that when you trip and fall, as we do regularly, you don't have a long way to fall. You might skin your knee or hurt your hand, but you can just get up and brush yourself off and keep moving. Um, you, you're not going to die. And so that simple comment from my therapist, or that sort of intuitive insight that he had about me, turned out to be real pay dirt for me. And I try to remember it. I try to embody it. I try to live by it. Um, and I've had, in my life, after I was a community organizer, and I don't want to get ahead of the story too much here, but after I was a community organizer, I decided to go to a Quaker community, um, where I spent the next 11 years in a Quaker living learning community, one of whose key features was we lived a life of radical economic equality. Everybody who worked there, no matter what degrees they had or what their job responsibilities were, was paid the same amount of money. At this adult study center or living learning community, I was dean of studies with a PhD from Berkeley. I got the same salary as an 18-year-old who came to work in the garden or cook in the kitchen, because he or she didn't know um, where to go next in life. And so this wasn't just an abstract insight for me. This business about we all live on the ground together. Um, I found by living in that community under those conditions of radical equality that there's so much to be learned when we take that not just as an aspirational notion, but we actually put into practice what it would mean to live in human equality, including around money, which is such a touchy subject for so many folks, and where again the ego gets snared and we get unreal.
I've I've so many questions are coming up in my head, but just the thing that's grabbing me the most is just even the most recent thing you've said there. What's that experience like of, as you say, you got your PhD from Berkeley, you're the dean of studies there, and then someone who's an 18-year-old working in the kitchen or something like that on the same salary. What kind of sense of community does that breed? Like, what, like, is it a very different or altered state of being versus what you were used to or what you've known since?
Yeah, I grew up in a very affluent community, even though I was the first person in my family to go to college. My parents just had high school diplomas. My dad was a successful businessman in Chicago, so I'd kind of grown up in the lap of luxury. Although my dad did everything in his power uh, to make sure that my sisters and I did not get silly notions about that. Did not think we were special. Um, he valued his blue collar roots in Iowa, and so when I was 12 and when I was 12 and my sisters subsequently turned 12, he said, "Well, we're finished with family vacations because from here on out, you're going to have to spend your summers working
Right.
to earn money." So, I had some good prep for this from a man, my father, that I very much admired, for whom this kind of thing was a core value. Don't think you're special. Uh, he used to say to me, um, "Just never believe your own press clippings, Parker." And that too has served me well. Um, so uh, I think what it was like for me was, first of all, there was struggle involved, especially around things that friends and colleagues who had taken a very different path in life. They had taken a path toward, um, upward mobility. Um, they'd found what I was doing nuts, and often pointed that out to me. What are you doing at this funky granola hippie Quaker place, as the phrase goes? You do realize you're going to disappear off the professional radar, don't you? What? Explain yourself, as if that were an obligation that I had. Which nobody really does. But I would do my best. And what I would say to them, even back in the time, Mark, was, look, I can barely explain myself to myself, let alone to you. I'm sure I'll have no success at that. But let me just put it this way: what I'm doing right now, I can't not do it. I can't not do it. And that double negative has been important to me as I've looked back, and I didn't have this language at the time, Mark, but as I've looked back, I think what I was saying was, if I don't do this thing to which I feel deeply called by this conversation I'm having with life, this phase of that conversation, I'm going to pay a soul price somewhere down the road. Uh, I was still young enough that I could go out and get a good job and make money, but there was something deep in me that said, what you're doing right now is going to be in the long run more rewarding than money. And if I can, I'll take a risk here, and I'll say something that I don't say to everyone. Um, that it took me years to realize this, and because it wasn't a motive of mine, but this curious career course that I followed, this fact that I followed my calling rather than got on some conventional career ladder, going up the ranks in academia or wherever. So I'm 5 years as a community organizer. I'm 11 years living in this Quaker community, having my sense of entitlement ground down. I found a nonprofit, the Center for Courage and Renewal, which helps people rejoin soul and role, with a couple hundred facilitators now operating all around the world. This unconventional path that I followed, I realized later, made me and my writing of more interest to people than my writing would have been had I gone up through the ranks in academia. My books have sold over 2 million copies. You don't find them on airport book stands, but they do well because there's a lot of people out there seeking a different path. And when they learn that I'm not just theorizing about it, but I've lived it, and I try to write as honestly as I can out of my own experience, that's when we get connected, writer to reader. And that's where community forms in my life. And in the case of this nonprofit I have founded, which is in the business of offering retreats for personal and communal development, that all of that experience that I've had, all of the ideas that have grown out of that part of my dialogue with the world have become actionable. I've always said I love putting wheels on ideas, so that these ideas, if they're good ideas, why not create vehicles that other people can use to ride them towards their own destinations? So they're not riding toward my idea of a good life. They're using these practices to ride toward their own understanding of a life that's good for them.
Which I think you can not only, but to fully mean it, to just suggest what you just said there, to write to your own idea of a good life. I think you can only kind of do that by going through a life yourself, which you're saying you can't anticipate, and that you've fully lived, and even to go back to this beautiful sentiment that this therapist of yours had of getting down to the ground. Because I think another reason what probably contributes is not only that it's your lived life, but just as a reader of your work, I'd say it's also because you're not in this at this elevation. You can even include things like a noticing or an honesty with the it was a Pendle Hill, was it? Is that?
Yes, Pendle Hill.
Yeah.
Community.
That you can admit to yourself in when you in Let Your Life Speak that you got offered a president's role with another institution, and you can basically admit to yourself that the main reason why you're contemplating it is because you want to call yourself a president again.
Yeah,
do you know what I mean?
And get my picture in the paper.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's just from my own experience, I think it's just by getting down to the ground somewhat that you can just say stuff like that without a heavy judgment or my motives ought to be something else. So I think it's all it all kind of coalesces together, like the lack of the inability to anticipate, the coming down from elevation, and then this really rich life experience from what you're relating to.
That's the way it feels to me, and it feels to me like you know, we can help each other take that journey down to the ground, not by putting each other down. And it's interesting, isn't
Yeah.
it, how we use the word down in our lexicon, and it's so often a put down or a come down or a demotion. Um, but we can help each other get real, not by putting each other down, but by inviting each other to reflect more deeply on what we're doing, to experience those times of silence and solitude, or silence in a relationship where the conversation is driven not by conclusions that someone else has come to, but by honest, open questions about what we mean and what we intend and who we are. We can hold each other that way. That's what the retreats at the Center for Courage and Renewal do. And it's powerful stuff.
I think though, just when you mentioned that word, what we intend to do, I think an honesty around our intention, which I think can come mainly so from either inviting each other down to the ground, or an experience of life that places us in contact with that. I think when we get to the point of honesty of intention, I think that's where we have kind of exponential opportunity for cultivating better relationships or community when we can get to that point of expression.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And the honesty is absolutely key, isn't it? And that obviously begins with um, being honest with ourselves. What is it that we really want here? Because so often we'll go into a situation masking our true intentions in order to create an illusion that will allow us to get what we want. And that just means building a life that is fabrication upon fabrication upon fabrication. It's a house of cards that eventually falls apart.
Just I'm really curious as to how you've gone through this, and maybe even for some encouragement for myself. I feel it's taking its own shape, but just your relationship with that idea of getting real. And so, look, obviously we can identify the oughts in life, what we can identify maybe how we'd love to have reacted in a certain situation. How have you found that balance of getting real acceptance, and then even still perhaps like observing even just your own development and still seeing what not calling that an elevation, but like just the evolution of that as well. How have you kind of observed those kind of coming together, those shifts?
Yeah, well, please probe what I'm about to say. I want to make sure I understand what you're asking about. But I think I learned early on that I'm capable, and I think we as a species are capable of sort of infinite self deception. And once you get clarity about X or Y or Z, and you get real about it or get honest about it, that doesn't mean that the job is done for the rest of your life, right? So it's an evolving process. It's an iteration that you have to keep moving through. Um, and sometimes getting real means coming to terms with hard things about yourself. I mean, the first thing, and I'll just use a silly example here. First thing that comes to me is to get real about your own limitations. Uh, I might aspire to be a ballet dancer, but it ain't going to happen. Even when I was physically more agile than I am now. So that flies in the face of the American um, naivete that says you can be anything you want. No, you really can't. We all have a nature And to have a nature means I have potentials and I have limitations. Press on your limitations, sure, explore your potentials, grow yourself as best you can, but don't fall into the trap that there's something wrong with you if it turns out that you can't do X, Y, or Z. Lots and lots of young people have discovered that no, they're not going to be the MDs they thought they were when they take organic chemistry in college, and that doesn't go well. And so, what's the turning there that is required in a life as you become more real about who you are and how you are? And sometimes that requires flying in the face of what other people want of you, which is another big snare and delusion. The whole book, Let Your Life Speak, is in many ways a protest against trying to live your life by someone else's script. It doesn't matter how much you love that person or how much that person loves you. They can't possibly know what best corresponds to your identity and integrity. In my case, you mentioned a little story from Let Your Life Speak, where I had in fact been invited to become the president of a small educational institution, and I went through a period of a process of discernment with other people, and came to this. I won't tell the whole story here, but came to this really embarrassing moment, right? When somebody kept asking me, what would you like most about being a president? And I couldn't find anything. I kept backing off. I said, I listed a bunch of things I knew I wouldn't like. I wouldn't like having to wear a suit every day. I'm just not that guy. I wouldn't like having to glad hand strangers, especially if it was just for money, when I didn't like those people, et cetera, et cetera. And this fellow kept saying, well, I asked you what you'd like. And I finally looked at my shoes and I said, well, I guess what I'd like most, and this was a bottom of the barrel truth moment. I guess what I'd like most is getting my picture in the paper with the word president under it. And which is obviously such a bald-faced ego statement, And there was a silence, and this fellow finally said, could you think of an easier way to get your picture in the paper? Which was a lovely sort of, grace note on what was really a moment of humiliation. Incidentally, I love the word humiliation because it's related to the word humus. It's about soil. It's about the ground of our being. It's about the real stuff of life out of which new stuff grows. So I don't get worried anymore about being humiliated. The question is, what have I just learned about myself that I need to remember? Nor do I worry, haven't for years, about becoming disillusioned, which is another thing we're always trying to, keep people from experiencing, because to be disillusioned means to lose an illusion. And if you lose an illusion, you're that much closer to being real, to getting real. So congratulations, you're disillusioned. How can I help disillusion you even more? I don't know if that addresses the question you were asking.
No, it does, and but it also brings up this lovely idea of limitations, which I've never, like, I've read a lot in different areas of maybe self-realization or and things of this nature. But the way you categorize limitations in terms of this really helpful guide, like it's your limitations can almost be as instructive as what you may consider to be your highest potential or expression of yourself. And in this really lovely way of self-acceptance, it's like you don't have to bang up against a limitation. It can show you as to, what will happen if you continually go there, and therefore to take the feedback that life is giving you. I hadn't, to be honest, I hadn't heard it really put that way or so straightforward. I don't think I've captured it as well as in the book, if you know what I mean. But there's just this really clear sense of like, I don't have to pain myself to try to either bend myself out of shape. I can just accept what is more, and it's not this. I don't know. There's not this urgency to fix something. Like your limitation is as much of a clue to your natural self as to where you feel like you're offering your gifts to the world.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's very well said. It's certainly the way I see it. Um, you use the word pain yourself to fix this or whatever. In fact, if we think about our own experiences of pain, for example, in my case, my experiences of depression, some of that came from me trying to press beyond my own organic limits, to be Superman in this or that area. And it was never in the cards. Or we can go back to the potter with the clay, and what's not in the cards, what if the potter isn't sensitive to the limits of the material he or she is working with, that pot's going to explode or become very ungainly. And I'll use one more analog or parallel. Um, Gandhi, entitled his autobiography, "My Experiments with Truth," and I've always loved that title, because through that lens, I've come to see life as a series of experiments that we conduct, about how best we can interact with the world, how best we can deploy our gifts in the world, how best we can appreciate life and engage in the life process more generally. As any scientist knows, some experiments fail. Um, and that means you've slammed into some limits that just, you've made some guesses that are wrong, and those variables don't go together that way. And as any good scientist will tell you, a failed experiment actually teaches you more about the nature of whatever you're working with than does a successful experiment. Because a successful experiment may identify a proper or an accurate, give you an accurate picture of certain interactions between variables, but it hasn't tested all the variables, and you don't know what else is necessarily at work in that equation. But when an experiment fails time and again, you can be certain that combination of variables doesn't work. And I find it very liberating to say, all right, my life is a series of experiments with truth. My job is to pay attention to what I'm learning, and not let my ego try to press past what I'm learning, because I don't like the outcome. I don't like the fact that experiment failed. I don't like the fact that I failed to achieve my goal of becoming an MD at age 30. So I'm going to fight that. A failed experiment is a source of valuable information, and that's all about limits. And limits, I think, also are an absolutely critical component of creativity. Ask a good artist about how he or she deals with the limitations of the size of the canvas they're working on, or the nature of the medium in which they're working, all of which have their limits. And great art comes out of respecting those limits as much as respecting the potentials that are there.
That's absolutely gorgeous. It's funny because especially with I don't know, maybe a painting that's very evocative, that seems like you've really have some Francis Bacon as an artist that I've enjoyed. There's some real darkness to it at times as well. And I never even considered he's constrained by the dimensions of a landscape.
Mm-hmm.
But this is I think that also points to like almost like a co-creation then with whatever your natural self is and the world, because even just because whatever our limits we've come up against in a particular scenario, there's still almost like an infinite possibilities of other directions we can go in life at any particular point. So it's almost, yes, there's constraints, but there's still kind of unbounded possibility. I was just really curious, Parker, just because you mentioned it again, that you had experiences of depression in your 40s and then again in your 60s. Just what was in need of your attention, or what did you need to kind of incorporate or see, or however you might put it? Well, I don't know the experience of what it was in your 60s anyhow, so I won't constrain it by that this kind of line of questioning too much. But how do you perceive your experience in your 60s after the experience in the 40s?
Yeah, I think, one could say, I suppose, that, okay, I was revisiting unresolved issues. That's not the way I see it. What I think in my 60s was happening was that it was the first stage of my reckoning with aging and death. Because when you're 65, you're looking at what's ahead through a different lens than you are in any other decade of life. At least I was. I mean, for some people, the prospect of death comes earlier, of course, under tragic circumstances. But for me, this was the first real reckoning of kind of crossing a boundary that made it very clear that I had a lot less time ahead of me than was now behind me. My dad had died at a younger age than I am now, and I think, as with a lot of men, that weighed on me, especially because he was such an important figure in my life. So it was partly about that, about the big question, um, and it was partly about my growing sense of vocational limitation, about
Hmm.
losing the energy to being on all of those airplanes, and seeing all those interesting cities, or at least the large hotels in all those interesting cities, had long ago, had stopped being romantic, and I was sort of wrestling with, how much longer do I want to do this? That was the first wave of questions, and then, is there some sort of vocational adjustment that I need to make to keep using my gifts, but in a more measured or well focused way? So I was working through all of that, it got heavy. Things were happening in the world that also press in on me, because I've always had this sense. I mean, obviously, at age 29, if I'm responding to the fact that cities are burning and abandoning a career track that I thought I was on, and had worked hard to get to, obviously I'm responsive to the world around me, and the world around us, uh, looked at through one lens anyway, is a pretty depressing place. Looked at through another lens, it's full of amazing people, amazing opportunities, amazing, amazing responses to the fascist darkness that we're facing once again on this planet. So you have to have a two-eyed view of the world. And at the time I was wrestling with that mid-60 depression, I think I wasn't good at looking at the world with both eyes. So I've worked on that since that time.
I think that's a glorious answer, and there's something quite beautiful about the continued, as you say, this paying attention to limitations, and even for anyone, I think that was for any moments where questioning of our own mortality and things like this come to mind as well. Just this is a whole process for us all, isn't it? Like at different points in time.
Yeah, as far as I know, nobody gets an exemption on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Parker, I've just looking at the time and just ahead of the last question of that I typically ask, but just you've given us so many beautiful ideas around even just this elevation and coming down to the ground, ideas of vocation, community connection, paying attention to your life, being in communication with your life, paying attention even to the limitations in your life as well as the gifts in our life. All these wonderful ways in which we can also just become more real with ourselves, real with each other, sharing our intentions and our experiences, and even just this lovely sense of what you feel is fed into your own writing from the point of view of having fully lived a life, and you're talking from experience as well, and how it's provided a life that once you can accept that you can't anticipate it, you can really have quite a wonderful ride, really. Just really curious to get your answer, Parker, to the question of what is a good life for you?
What is a good life to me? Well, you know that I'm kind of a wordy guy, except when I'm just being silent. So at age 85, it's kind of a hard question to answer in short compass, but I'll do my best. I think at bottom, Mark, um, I think a good life is one rooted in a deep appreciation for life and a desire to pass it along to others. Um, so gratitude and generosity, I think, are the drivers of a good life, and I think those two ways of being in the world can express themselves in so many different ways. Um, and any way a person has of doing that, whether it's within the confines of your own home or in your neighborhood or in your city or in support of the natural world or um, the common good in political terms, any way you have of actively expressing gratitude and generosity adds up to a good life.
Well, Parker, on that note, I will thank you very, very much for your time today. I've greatly appreciated. I've really enjoyed this conversation and all that you've shared. So, thank you very much for joining us today on the What Is a Good Life
I've
podcast.
enjoyed it a lot too, Mark. I know it was a little tricky for us to find a time to get together. I'm awfully glad we did. I wish you all the best with your good work. I've really enjoyed this hour plus.
Wonderful. Thank you.